Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you've had a good first day of PASS Summit. My name is Allan Hirt, and for about the next 75 minutes to 90 minutes, I'm going to be talking to you about troubleshooting clusters. I'm going to cover both FCI type stuff and a little bit of AG, but they're really related because I'm going to be talking more about the Windows side of things that can go wrong that affect SQL. I'm not going to necessarily focus on the SQL side of things. So, because this is honestly where most of the things go wrong in a cluster. So it's going to be pretty intense that way. I'm going to do a bunch of different demos towards the end. Hopefully they're all working. I was just testing them out about an hour ago, so hopefully they're still working. Just a couple bits of housekeeping. I'm sure you'll see this all week, but if your cell phones are set to sound, please turn them off. If you have to answer a call or something, just be respectful of your neighbors and exit as quietly as you can. Again, another slide you're going to see all week. And I also encourage you to fill out your session eval for this session. Good, bad, or indifferent, I do like feedback. So please be constructive in your criticisms if there are any, because I can only improve as a speaker if you tell me what went wrong. And just another bit of housekeeping, this session is also going to be broadcast on PASS TV. So a welcome to everyone sitting out there in the audience. As I said, just a quick warning, this session is pretty Windows intense. So if you're not familiar with some of that stuff, that's okay. You can hopefully rewatch it later, but I'm just giving you a heads up on this stuff. All right. Something up front that I get asked for all the time that I figured I'd just put out right here. These are pretty much all the acronyms I may talk about this entire session. So I'm not going to read the list down, but they're very important because in the Windows world and in the SQL Server world, there are a ton of acronyms that get thrown about a lot. So this is pretty much all the ones that you kind of have to worry about in the cluster world with some rare exceptions. Some of these are like Active Directory related, for example, GPOs, OUs as well. That's an Active Directory thing. So there's a lot of stuff you sort of have to keep straight. I know, just sort of as another quick bit of housekeeping, the PowerPoint isn't up there for download yet. It will be later. So don't worry about that. Okay. So how to sort of you start thinking about clusters? First of all, the key to understanding clusters and, quite frankly, to understanding troubleshooting clusters is to understand what you're dealing with. And what you're dealing with is a very tightly coupled stack. So first, you obviously have your hardware, and I lump into there things like storage, networking, the physical hardware box, all that kind of stuff. On top of that, you install your operating system. In this case, it's going to be Windows. And this, by the way, kind of doesn't matter whether we're talking about physical servers or virtual servers, because a virtual server, you would basically take out, to some degree, the hardware layer, but there's also a different layer of hardware underneath the VM, which is the hypervisor, and what it sits on. So it's still relevant in this stack picture. Then you would configure a Windows Server failover cluster, which sits on top of and joins any servers participating in the cluster. Those servers are known as nodes in the cluster world. And on top of that, you then have your clustered applications, of which SQL Server, and by that, in this context, I mean a SQL Server clustered instance or the availability groups feature, commonly known as the always-on features from a marketing perspective, but here I'm going to separate them out because they're very specific and different things. So keep this picture in your mind as I start talking about a few of the things and I go into some demos, because this is essentially how you're going to have to approach a lot of this stuff. Now, I know a lot of you may not be, say, Windows admins. How many people here, just a show of hands, do a lot of general Windows admin stuff in addition to SQL? That's a pretty healthy amount of you, so about a third of you. All right. So a lot of this talk should be pretty relevant to you. If you're mainly DBAs, what I would like you to take away from this is some of the languages and some of the things you might have to think about, and then to be able to have that conversation with those other admins who may be responsible for these types of things that I'm showing. All right. Couple bits of housekeeping that I want to get up front as to why people may have failed implementations or problems along the way. First and foremost, I've been doing clustering for well over half my career, working with SQL Server, actually. I started in roughly 1992 with SQL Server. I started clustering 98, 99-ish, so I've been doing this a long time. And I've heard pretty much, I think, every epithet in different languages thrown at clusters. The reason, now I'm not saying Microsoft doesn't have any culpability here, especially in the early years when clustering could have been a dicey proposition. But at this point, when they've largely fixed a lot of the implementation issues to make things easier to some degree, people have held on to the fact that clusters are bad because they had a bad experience at some point. I'm here to tell you, as somebody who's done this for a long time, that's not true. Most of the reason that clusters go south is because people do something wrong along the way. Now, do production issues happen? Absolutely. But if you have issues earlier on especially, it's because somebody did something wrong or forgot something along the way. And while it's not totally the focus of the session, the best way to have stable, reliable clusters is to build them right. You know, go through all your checklists. Make sure that everything is in place. I'll give you a quick example. About, I want to say at this point, 10 years ago, I was working with a customer in upstate New York. They were implementing Siebel. I think it was an NT4 SQL 2000 or SQL 7. I think it was, yeah, SQL 2000 cluster. So that dates it. We spent about 3 months planning the cluster, and it was roughly half a day, whole day to implement the whole thing. After we were done, they kind of said to me, they gave me this look on their face. I could tell something was bothering them. And what they kind of said to me was, I kind of looked at them and said, what's wrong? Like, you know, this is successful, we were done, this is great, everything's working. Well, as it turns out, for them, it was sort of anticlimactic because we literally spent 3 months planning this thing and it was less than a day to implement. And so I said to them, and this is the truth, because we spent 3 months working out any potential issues we might have had and any roadblocks, this all went smoothly. I can tell you from experience that, you know, over the past especially couple years, I worked with clients, be they remotely or on site, and if we've run into problems during implementation, let's say in an Active Directory or other types of things, we get to a point, we have a problem, we have to stop, we have to go figure out what the problem is, then we need to, if it involves someone else, again, Active Directory is a great example, we need to go find that resource, if they're even available. They have to do something that may take an hour, it may take a week. So I've had implementations that should have taken less than half a day take 4 weeks because of process and people issues. So this is why I do not want to trivialize the fact that if you get things right up front, you won't have these issues when you go to implement. Because clusters are very easy to just fire off. You can either run a PowerShell command, you can run a wizard a couple times, and in theory it's just quickly done. But it's not that easy in reality. Here's another thing so I'm glad that a good portion of you raised your hands and said you do a lot of Windows stuff, but for those of you that do not do a lot of Windows stuff, I can tell you a critical path to your success with any form of clustering, that means if you have deployed clustered instances, are planning on deploying clustered instances, have deployed AGs or will be deploying AGs sometime in your future, you need to have at least a functional knowledge of networking, storage, Windows, and clustering. If you don't, you're going to have a really rough time. I'm not saying it to make you angry. I'm not saying it because, I happen to be a cluster MVP. I'm saying it because it's true. And it goes back to that picture of the stack. When you install SQL Server, it's the last thing in the chain. SQL Server, while it essentially knows about stuff underneath, as a DBA, SQL Server obfuscates some of that, but not all of it, and some of the admin stuff you're going to have to do is actually in Windows. Unlike Exchange, for example, who's basically completely obfuscated the fact that you're almost running on a cluster, SQL has not done that. So if you're managing things like Quorum, or you're doing things along those lines, you have to know Windows. And I could tell you from experience, just a quick show of hand, I bet I know the answer to this. So how many people here have implemented, be it clusters or anything else in SQL, your sysadmins kind of look at you and go, yeah, we don't quite want to support this. You guys are on your own. Quick show of hands, how many people are in that situation? About a third of you. So that's why this stuff is important, because you essentially become your own tech support. I've seen this too often where, a good example non-cluster is the rest of the company has standardized monitoring, but you guys have to buy all your own monitoring tools because they won't let you hook into their stuff. So I've seen this quite often. The other thing as well is that from my perspective, sort of as I hinted at earlier, especially in terms of troubleshooting, there isn't a lot of difference to me whether you're troubleshooting physical or virtual, because you can cluster VMs. Totally supported, not a big problem. There are some constraints around that, which I'm not going to totally get into in this session, but for all intents and purposes, treat them the same. All right. First thing that you need to worry about, and this is something especially for those of you who don't control your own destiny in the way you install your OS and get the cluster configured, is that you have a supported cluster. Now, what does that mean in terms of a WSFC? Well, number one, it passes validation tests, and I'm going to demo validation for you, so don't worry about that just yet. And the hardware itself has to have one of those logos on there. Now, Microsoft technically says that it has to be logoed for the OS that you're running on. So, for example, if you're going to deploy Windows Server 2012 R2, which is RTM last month, it should technically have that logo, but I've never technically seen them enforce that, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't heed the warning. They care more about the fact that you pass the validation test, because if you call support, they're going to ask you if you ran validation, and either give them the report, and I'm going to show you where that lives, or they're going to force you to run it. One of the two. That's definitely a monopoly, do not pass go, do not collect $100 moment. Another interesting thing, though, that people don't realize is that you can mix both physical and virtual nodes in the same cluster. So let's say, for example, you have a DR site that's just made up of hypervisor, be it VMware, Xen, Hyper-V, whatever your flavor of virtualization that you use. And let's say you're just doing availability groups, which doesn't require shared storage. You could configure a VM in Site B to be part of essentially a geographically dispersed cluster, and that's perfectly fine. As long as it passes this validation test, it doesn't matter. Another interesting thing that has changed over the years is that now Microsoft doesn't really care if you have different vendors in your cluster. So if you're a shop that has various hardware, and let's say you have HP and Dell, you can mix them in the same cluster. Now, me personally, I tend to like to say same vendor, same server, type of server, all that stuff. But again, it goes back to just passing validation. Microsoft isn't validating the vendor, it's just validating the configuration. So, question? Yeah, yes. So the question is, if you have SQL already clustered, and sort of taking the scenario that I said, if you want to add a node that's a VM later, can you do that? Yes. Yes. So the question is, if SQL is clustered, so if it's an FCI, so if you have a clustered instance of SQL, can you add a standalone later? Yes, you can. There are some things that you need to do to make sure that it's right, but from a high-level standpoint, yes, you can create that. So I'm going to point out real quick, so when you get the PowerPoint, later or tomorrow, whenever you download it. The reason I put these links is because this is what Microsoft says is the official word for clustering in terms of how it needs to be supported. And the reason I put these links is because it doesn't matter if I say it and I'm a cluster MVP, it doesn't matter if I've written it in now 4 or 5 books or white papers or whatever else, your admins are going to want the official Microsoft word on it. And I don't mean the program word, I mean the official Microsoft language around what supportability means. So I highly suggest that those are things that you bookmark or have at your hand, have at the ready, because I guarantee you if they're fighting you on certain configuration aspects, that's what you're going to need. And for virtualization, same thing. I've also put the links, the relevant virtualization things. And one of the reasons I put the VMware link is because VMware supports specific things when it comes to storage, if you're going to virtualize, say, an FCI. So for those of us that are consultants, we all refer to that VMware article, and that's why I put it there. So this validation process, what is it? Let me give you a little bit of history. So how many people here, quickly, show of hands, worked with clusters pre-Windows Server 2008? Most of you. All right. So hopefully you will remember there was one thing which morphed into something else. At one point it was called the hardware compatibility list. At another point later on it was called the Windows Server catalog. When you went to go deploy a cluster, it wasn't as simple as buying some hardware or storage, putting it together and installing Windows and then installing SQL. What you had to do, you had to make sure that your entire configuration was either in the HCL when it was that or the Windows Server catalog. And the problem with that was, and I can speaking from a consultant's point of view, is that it was a nightmare for everyone involved. First of all, it went down to firmware and BIOS on HBA cards and storage units, all that kind of stuff. So let's say you had the right nodes with all the right stuff, but your storage firmware was different. You didn't have a supported cluster. Now, let's take the point of view of hardware manufacturers. They're just trying to sell you some hardware or some services or something, right? So for them, they don't care if it's not a G7. If they have G6s and they want to blow them out, they're trying to sell you a G6. The IT guys just want to get this thing done, so they don't really care about the HCL. Microsoft's trying to force people to have what they know to be a good configuration, and they're not winning because the vendors aren't complying, the IT folks don't really care, and I'm trying to make sure, as a consultant, to make sure that everything's supportable, because as a consultant, one of my jobs is to make sure that what you do is going to be supported by your vendors, period. And one of those vendors in this case is obviously going to be Microsoft. So, needless to say, oh, and to boot, let's say things were different later on. So your HBA vendor decided to update the driver. That needed to be certified. And that didn't necessarily make it to the HCL or the Windows Server catalog. It may be in a separate document on their website that you need a support contract to get, or if it's so obfuscated you never find it. This was a royal pain. So when they re-architected clustering with Windows Server 2008, they implemented this validation process which runs a series of tests, and it basically says you've got a good configuration, we think you've got a good configuration, but there's some things you need to look at, or don't go there. The problem with don't go there is that if you're not responsible for building the cluster, Microsoft basically has an option after you run validation, even if it fails, and if you say, yes, I'd like to build this, they pop up a nice warning that says, I'll let you create this, we don't recommend it, nor will you be supported. And as a DBA who's going to now be building either availability groups or an FCI or FCIs on top of this, that's bad. So you guys need to check things like validation. Again, when I get to demo world, I'm going to show you what that looks like. All the validation reports live in this directory. That is something you're going to become very familiar with as a DBA if you're not already. The other thing about validation, so those of you that have installed an FCI, know that it's like the third or fourth screen in after you get through the EULA and stuff like that, and you pick your features. It runs a bunch of checks against the cluster. And one of the first checks that it looks at is MSCS validation errors. So first of all, MSCS is wrong terminology, and I'm trying to get them to fix that in setup. Been trying for a while. It's one of those closed not will fix because it's not that important to them. But beyond that, this is what it stems from, because SQL Server setup actually goes out to this directory and looks at what's there to see if it's good or not. So this should also be your first clue that something is wrong. Now, if it's green, don't even worry about it. Although I say that, and that's technically not true. There's a way to fake this out. So SQL Server setup does a good job by doing a first blush pass and going out there and seeing, well, it looks like things are good. I got, everything passed. The problem with it is that how you can fake it out, and again, I'll show you when I demo validation for you, is that you could run a single test that's successful, have it come back as good, and then say rerun that validation thing, and it will show you as successful. So you still have to go out and check even if it says green. Because again, if your admins know that trick, they can trick you out too. So be careful. The other thing that you need to worry about too is if anything major changes in terms of the configuration, Microsoft requires that you rerun validation. There are other reasons you'd run it later as well, and I'm going to show that to you. But bottom line here is that validation is one of the most important tools you have in your arsenal as a DBA for successful clusters, either pre-installation or post-installation. And it's one of the first things I always look at if we're having cluster troubles. Because one of the things that's also not advertised because it doesn't look really great on a marketing slick is that after you configure a Windows Server failover cluster, what Microsoft actually does is they run an additional set of tests that are best practice tests. So, like I said, validation is not only useful beforehand, but it's also useful afterwards. So what can go wrong in your cluster? Pretty much everything. But in no order, I think I'm hopefully driven the point home that if you don't understand this stuff, you're going to have a rough go of it. And I don't ever want to trivialize that because most of the cluster issues I've seen have all stemmed from somebody not understanding what they're doing. Planning, same thing. Like I said, the 3 months, we got it right. People want to call me up and plan for 2 days and then go implement. We spend 4 weeks doing it because we have go back and forth. Active Directory problems, and this is one of the demos I'm going to show you and talk to you about. Active Directory will be one of your nightmares in this scenario because a Windows Server failover cluster requires Active Directory. Your admins may hate that. Your admins may never want to do it. They don't have a choice. This is the only way clustering works. So if you have a problem using AD, don't even think about implementing clusters because it creates objects on the back end, and I'm going to actually show you what those are. Networking, especially when it comes to things like Quorum and needing communication between your nodes and making sure that the cluster can talk amongst the nodes. If you have bad networking, that's going to lead to reliability issues. Also, let me throw a couple other things out there at you just from a networking standpoint, which aren't necessarily in the deck, but something you need to ask. So, quick show of hands, how many people here actually know what their network topology looks like in their environment? Surprising, it's about 10 to 15% of you. For the other 85% of you, you need to start asking questions. Because, for example, when they rack and stack your hardware and put it into wherever, do you know if your NICs are all plugged into the same switch? How many people here know that answer? Okay, about 10% of you. So for the other 90%, that's problem number one that's going to hurt you. Because you're assuming that when they present you with your servers that are all configured, everything's been done right before that. because you have no control over where it gets placed in a rack. You have no control about the cabling. You just get a server. Well, think about clusters for a second. The whole point is to have redundancy, to have separation. If things fail over, you go from one node to another, or however many nodes you have in your cluster. What if all your network cards, or let's say just your public network or whatever, are plugged into the same switch in the same rack, and you lose the switch? You lose your cluster. So you need to ask these questions as you're building your clusters, because even if you did everything right and did what I do, you spend 3 months planning this thing, everything goes great, a single net switch failure takes you completely out. And guess what? You're responsible at the end of the day because you're the DBA and the database server is down. Now, granted, a switch being down also affects other servers too, but you're still responsible for this problem and getting back up and running. Because if things, let's say, even went down harder than that, and let's say you lost power or something like that, you may be at the mercy of other stuff, and you may be in suspect mode. Or let's say, for example, you're using iSCSI, and that's networking. That's pure networking, actually. So what happens if the switch goes down? What does that do to your network traffic? What does that do to SQL Server? How do things behave in that scenario? These are the types of things you need to work through before you go live. If you don't, good luck to you. Question in front.
Not really a question, more of a comment. I've noticed that a lot of networking people don't like the idea of having a separate network equipment for the hardware. They're like, okay, we'll just put it on its own VLAN. And then end up having it hooked to the same switches as the front-end traffic. So that switch goes down, and suddenly, not only is the front-end down, but all the communication between all the nodes is down, and it's like, oh, cluster's gone, shut down.
Correct. So the comment basically was that some admins, in his experience, don't like to have a whole other thing for the redundant cluster network. And let me address that in a second. So they plug it into the same switch, and then they have kind of like what I talked about. The switch goes down, and they have issues. So let me talk to you a little about the way clustering is supposed to work. So in the pre-Windows Server 2008 days, Microsoft basically said you should have an externally facing network, or what we usually call the public network, and an internally facing network that was dedicated to the cluster only, which we usually called the private network. Some people called it the heartbeat network, but basically there were two distinct networks that they were hopefully plugged into separate switches, so you would have one dedicated for cluster traffic, one dedicated for whatever else you were doing. Let me tell you that things are different now, and let me explain that. Microsoft still recommends redundancy. That hasn't changed. However, they no longer require that it is a dedicated public-private. You could technically have two networks. It doesn't matter. As long as the cluster can still talk amongst the nodes, Windows doesn't really care whether they're two public-private like the old way. Doesn't matter. So if say your Windows guys are stuck on the way things were done in the past, they don't need to be. Now, where does network teaming for your cards, NIC teaming come into that? That's an interesting discussion. We talked about this yesterday in my pre-con a little bit, but it also changes the paradigm. Because Microsoft will throw you a warning in validation if you have a single network, or if what appears as a single network card shows up in the cluster. Now, if you have two network cards that are plugged into separate switches but happen to be teamed NIC, that may actually be okay. Even though validation will throw up the warning, you're going two separate paths, and it's presenting as one single network to the server, but it's still redundant at the hardware level, at the switch level, but it's presented as one to Windows. So in theory, that may be okay, and you will be able to continue on with your cluster configuration. So that's what I'm saying. Things are a bit different now in the way that you may look at things than we did in the old way in Windows Server 2003. All right, storage. That's another big sticky wicket, because this is one where even if you're Windows folks, or to some degree you're Windows folks and you're doing some co-admin there, I bet you don't control your storage. That's generally something that's presented to you, and you just deal with whatever they give you. So with that comes along all those problems. Storage goes down, HBAs are not configured right, pathing is wrong, they wired the wrong fiber to the wrong thing, they didn't do proper zoning and masking so somebody else comes and grabs things, disk signatures change because somebody's mucking around on the back end. All that kind of stuff affects you. And where you have in an FCI some potentially shared storage, because that's also changed a little bit, if you do have true shared storage, you're going to have issues. Now, the good thing is that one of the things that validation does is if you do have storage, it's going to test your basic connectivity for all those disks and failover. So if you have problems, you should know up front for the most part. All right, a couple other ones. Security, that kind of ties back to AD a bit. So if you have the wrong permissions, somebody sets GPOs that block you from, say, installing stuff or creating objects. Hopefully the demo I have is going to work with that. If your firewalls aren't configured properly, so your cluster nodes can't talk or configure things. And usually most people turn off the Microsoft firewall inside Windows, so that's usually not the issue. It's your external firewalls. Because even if you disable the Microsoft stuff, you're still going to have to do what you would have normally done in the Microsoft one to all your external firewalls. So all the ports clustering needs to talk, all that kind of stuff needs to get configured. So yeah, you're going to be having a lot of conversations when you're configuring clustering. Now, the good thing about things like firewalls is that once they get it right once, you don't have to worry about it again. But you still have to have the conversation. Last, but certainly not least, in this mix of things that can go wrong, Quorum. I could spend a whole day talking about Quorum. Clearly, I don't have time for that. But let me explain to you what Quorum is and why it's so important. Quorum, basically, think of voting, legislative body, whatever else. And for the cluster to be up, the majority of voters have to be up and running in this case. If you don't have the majority of voters, you're going to go down. Now, Quorum is a concept, but again, let me backtrack and give you a little history to explain where we are now. So prior to Windows Server 2003, so I'm talking NT 3.5.1, NT 4, and Windows 2000 Server, there's only one way to ever do Quorum, and that was you would have a disk. Didn't matter how many nodes you had, because with they introduced in Windows 2000 Data Center, I think you could have 8 node clusters. Woo! So then again, not too many people did it, but if you had 8 nodes, you would still only have disk Quorum cluster, and if that went down, your entire cluster went down. So if you lost your Quorum, you were toast. In Windows Server 2003, they introduced another Quorum model. So we've added to the language. So no longer is it just a disk Quorum. There was something called majority node set. And basically what that was is if you had an odd number of nodes, it didn't use a disk, but it basically used something within the nodes itself to make sure that you were up and running. And if you went down, you could add a disk Quorum if you needed to. But bottom line here is that Microsoft got a little smarter and said, we prefer you to have an odd number of votes in this configuration so that there's always a +1 somewhere. In Windows Server 2008, they moved the language forward a little bit, so they basically took the concept of majority node set. It's now called node majority. And there are 2 flavors of it. There's node majority with disk witness and node majority with file share witness. And the old Quorum that we used to call just Quorum is now called disk only. It's legacy, and you should, and I will tell you right now, never, ever, ever, ever use it. So if your cluster guys are from days when we used disk only Quorums and they want to do that, run screaming, because you are in for a world of hurt if something goes down. So what these 2 new, essentially, variations of node majority are, because node majority is still in there, is it adds that extra thing. So let's say you have a 2-node cluster, and you have shared storage because you're doing an FCI. You would generally configure a disk witness, so you would have 3 votes in that case. And as long as prior to Windows Server 2012 R2, you have the majority up, you're fine. Now, they've continued this even further in Windows Server 2012, where they have something called dynamic quorum. So as long as you don't lose essentially half or more of your nodes within like 5 seconds of each other, it will adjust the number of votes down, and you can essentially, with Windows Server 2012, assuming best case scenario, get down to last man standing. So you could be running on one node, assuming you have all the right performance, you have no other issues, with everything that you've got in your cluster on one node with Windows Server 2012, which is not something you could really ever do with Windows Server 2008 R2 and earlier. Now, even in Windows Server 2012 R2, they've taken this one step further, and there's also now the concept of dynamic witness. Now, this doesn't really work well for geographically dispersed scenarios, but what it essentially does in Windows Server 2012 R2 is, besides dynamic, just the quorum where they adjust votes on the fly, is it basically asks you to configure some sort of witness, be it file share or disk. And it will figure out if you need it or not. So if let's say you had 3 nodes, you have a disk witness, and you lose one of the nodes. It will roll in that disk witness, so you will now have 3 voters as part of your cluster. So the reason all this is important is because all this happens behind the scenes behind SQL Server that's essentially invisible to you. What you need to do for Quorum is you need to keep track of what's up and what's down. Because if you're not keeping track of what's up and what's down, and you're not querying the cluster and you're not looking at things, things may seem fine, but what happens if you're down to one node of your cluster? Because in Failover Cluster Manager, it's basically going to have a warning saying, yeah, you're down to one node, lose something else, and you're in trouble, buddy. So this is where you need to pop your head out of SQL Server land and start looking at things at the cluster level to see if you're at a good quorum state. That should be part of your normal monitoring techniques. And I don't want to trivialize this because it's not. This is something that most people, how many people here just on a regular basis look at what's going on for Quorum? More than I thought, about 5-7% of you. But this is really, really stuff that most of you probably never thought about. Because again, you create the cluster, oh, there's this Quorum thing, it just gets done, I don't have to worry about it. Now, I would say to a degree this is true now with Windows Server 2012 R2, where it does largely dynamically manage stuff, and it will prevent you from getting into a lot of trouble. But I don't think most of you in this room are probably going to go implement Windows Server 2012 R2 tomorrow. So since you're probably stuck on older versions of Windows, you're going to have to do it more manual. Okay, so what do I use for troubleshooting? I already talked about I'd use validation as one of my biggest tools in my arsenal. When you generate stuff in the cluster, for example, when you create the cluster, it actually generates an output file. So you can look at things like that and see, well, what went wrong, or does it give me any clues? There are the Windows event logs. There are SQL Server setup logs. It's regular log. Now, I can tell you I've looked at the SQL Server setup log more than any human probably ever should outside of somebody in SQL Dev. And there's pretty much, if you know what you're looking for, the SQL Server setup log, and I'll show you where that lives, will glean you the most information for failed SQL Server installs. The cluster log itself, and in the next couple slides, I'm going to explain to you that it's not really a log anymore. I'm going to explain to you how it's different. And obviously, this is stuff that you may not have access to, but you may need to coordinate, and that would be things like your SAN logs, or, I don't know, your switch configuration, things. If you're trying to match things up and see where things are going south, trace routes, that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about there. All right, so if you're looking at Event Viewer, you just kind of need to understand where things live in Event Viewer. And If you're looking just for informational stuff, they have something called the operational channel, but everything else goes in what's known as the system channel. And I'm going to show you where some of this stuff is, but I just want to get through this stuff and then we're going to go into demo land. So I mentioned that the cluster log is no longer really a physical file, as it were. Well, what they did, again, when they re-architected things in Windows Server 2008, they made it in ETW, or a event trace in Windows. So when you generate out a cluster log with the a get cluster log command in PowerShell, it basically goes against this and munges it and gives you a text file that looks like the old cluster log, but it really isn't the old cluster log. So if your sysadmins are frantically searching for where this cluster log lives, they're never going to find it because it doesn't exist. You actually have to generate a file from this stuff that looks like it but really isn't it. The event trace stuff lives in that little folder there that I link. There are a couple things that you may want to consider from the get-go for configuring a cluster. And on the 2 slides from now, you're going to see where this comes into play a bit more. The default size for the cluster log, each of the log files, is 100 megabytes, which in normal circumstances really shouldn't be that big of a deal because if you're not having a lot of issues, the default just works. The problem is if you're having a lot of issues, you'll see in a minute why that may be bad. You can also change this is a full WSFC level setting. It's not a one-time use setting, but it's essentially a setting at the cluster level. The amount of stuff that gets logged in the file, there are essentially 6 levels, 0 to 5. 5 being you get the most stuff and you can see what you get there. So for example, if you want the debug information, and if that's the kind of thing, if you're on the phone with CSS, they may want that stuff, but generally, don't set it to 5 unless you're reading, if you're masochistic and want to generate cluster logs all the time and look at them, maybe you want to do that, but the default is 3. That's good enough for most people. I would say if you're going to ratchet it up, maybe look at 4, because most people don't need debug information. So as I said, there are 3 files. Now, to generate out the file in PowerShell, it's get cluster log. You can generate it out to a specific place, but if you don't specify a place, it goes to that Windows cluster reports directory that I showed you earlier. That's where it goes by default. And if you don't specify a node name, it will generate it for all the nodes and put that file on each of the nodes. So if you just want a single node's worth, you could just specify the node name and it'll generate that out. If you only want to look, if say your problem happened in the last 30 minutes, you can actually specify the time frame you want the logs to be generated from. So if your problem happened in the last 30 minutes, you would put 30 there since that's in minutes, and it will generate 30 minutes essentially worth of log for you. Now here's the problem, which is what I was alluding to on the previous slide. There potentially could be log gaps, and this is in the way that the mechanism works for logging. So first of all, when you start out with a single log file, things are great. But what most people don't know is that, kind of like a T-log, it wraps around. So think of the way we work as DBAs. If you're constantly pruning your T-log, it never really grows, it reuses itself, it's all good. Similar concept here, where you have a log file. If you don't reboot, it fills up to 100 meg and starts wrapping around. So if you generate the cluster log file, if you had an issue, the reason we call it log gaps is because if it wrapped around, then you may not get all the events back to a certain point, or if things are at different places. So you need to understand that. This is also why some people also increase the size of them if they start to have issues because they don't want log gaps. Now, what happens now is if you reboot the server, it creates another file. And this is where the total number of files starts to come in. And that first file is left alone, and it starts using this new file from the beginning, and then it'll do the same thing. It'll wrap around ad infinitum, and then if you reboot again, you get starting to get the picture. And then if you reboot, it goes back to the first file. Now, when you run the get cluster log, it will munge all of these together and create you, again, what kind of look like the old log file, which is, again, part of the reason for the gaps. So if everything was all wrapped around and you see jumps and gaps of time, because it's now generating from 3 files that wrapped around at some point, you may be scratching your head. So if you've ever seen it, this is why that happens. So this is something, if you're troubleshooting, you have to be aware of, that you may actually potentially be missing information from earlier if things wrapped around. And again, this is another reason why some people will create more than 3 files, and they will also increase the size. By default, I don't necessarily recommend you do that if you're not having issues, but it's certainly something to consider in your deployments. All right. Before I get into demo land, last slide. So how do I deal with troubleshooting issues? First and foremost, take a deep breath, because you're either in for a rough ride or it might be apparent, but you'll figure it out. Hopefully you won't get too stressed over it. How you approach this, quite honestly, is going to be, how down are you? Now, if you're partially down, like a disk is down or a resource is down, it may be important, but it's not the same as your entire cluster being down or a set of servers being down. Different paths you're going to take, different things you're going to look at. Because obviously, if an entire server dies, that's a whole other issue than I lost a network card or I lost a path on my network. So, the other big question here is, obviously being DBAs, the first people where they're going to call are us if it's related to SQL Server. We know this. Doesn't matter if it's the application, doesn't matter if it's the network or whatever else, they're calling us because they know it touches SQL Server. Therefore, it's got to be a database problem, right? So if you're unaware of anything else happening, start asking around if something else happened. Now, I know admins are sometimes shifty, and they don't want to admit that something happened. But the reality is, I bet something else is going on at the same time to cause this issue if it's not SQL related. Quick fun fact, though. Prior to validation, when it really reduced the number of support calls, I think this number probably is still largely true, quite frankly. I would have to ask the support guys if it is. But a good couple years ago, there was a statistic from PSS, who's now CSS, that roughly 70 to 75% of all the support cases for clusters for SQL Server had nothing to do with SQL Server. And this is why you had to ask what else is going on, because here's another example of why that's important. I was doing a roadshow a few years ago on consolidation with Microsoft. I think it was in Ohio somewhere, and we were sort of swapping war stories. This guy raises his hand. And he basically said, yeah, one weekend, our SAN administrators updated the firmware on our SAN. They didn't tell anyone they were going to do it. They figured it'd be no big deal. I think we all see where this one's going. But in the process, they took out like 30 servers. They were down for 2 weeks. Yeah, I think somebody lost their job over that. But bottom line is, this is why communication needs to happen, because if somebody does something where they think it's just as simple as this weekend we're going to update the firmware on the SAN. Now that should be a red flag for you guys to know, A, which servers are sitting on that SAN. So again, goes back to asking questions when you're configuring. When they present you storage, know which storage unit you're attached to. Secondly, make backups and get those backups off of that SAN for all the databases on your server. And third, make sure you have a plan if that goes down where you're going to go to or restore these databases. Because the DBAs in that case had no way to plan for this event because they weren't told that, and the storage guys didn't think it was important enough to tell them that it was going to happen. This stuff happens with clusters too. Somebody updates firmware on a router switch that may reset all the settings, for example. Things like that happen all the time, but it manifests itself in SQL Server because SQL Server itself goes down, but has nothing to do with SQL Server. think this also underscores what I'm talking about here is communication. When you're in a troubleshooting effort, it's a tightly coupled stack, and if you're in an environment that has separate Windows admins, storage admins, network admins, AD admins, security admins, admin to wash somebody's hands, I don't know. You need to make sure that you have at least a good working relationship with them. And I'm not saying you need to be like best pals and like drinking buddies, but you need to at least be able to get along with them in the workplace and be able to work with them when these things happen. Because if you don't, this starts happening. And you're down longer because nobody wants to talk to each other. If you're supposed to be on the same team, actually be on the same team and get this done. Worry about whose fault it is later, just get up and running. Now sometimes, and you'll see in some of my examples, the answers may be painfully obvious what the problem is. Other times it may not be even remotely what the error message says it is. So don't assume that even by reading all this stuff that it's apparent. All right, so I've talked enough. Now let me actually show you some troubleshooting stuff. So wait till this comes back. All right, so here I've got a bunch of VMs. And which demo am I going to show first? I think I'll show this one. And unlike yesterday, I'm not showing a Windows Server 2003 cluster. I've had my fill. Oh, that's not going to help me. All right, I'll leave this here. Actually, let me sit down because bending over is not great for my posture. Okay. So let's say I want to, actually, I'm going to do another thing first. So I've got my cluster here. His name's Steely Dan. I've got two SQL instances, Asia and Pretzel Logic. And my storage admin added this disk to it and said, because we needed some more storage, we need to put some more databases on. And they said, we'll give you a disk. You know, your admins added it to the cluster. To them, they're done. It's like, it's all good. So you go to use this thing. Let's try and go create a database. Its drive. This is simple troubleshooting, actually. I'm going to get more difficult. I'm trying to show the easy ones first. So it's drive P. I want to go create a new database on drive P. So I go out here. I want to move it. Wait a minute, where's my drive P? All right, yeah, you got it, but not everybody knows that answer. So for those of you that don't know how this works, the SQL Server is dependent on other resources to be successful. So for a drive to be seen by SQL Server, it needs to be made a dependency of SQL Server. So there are a couple ways to check this, first of all. Before I go back and show this, let me show you a query you can run. So if you do sec from sys.dmio cluster shared drives, lo and behold, it only shows E and F. So right there, you can see in SQL Server, it officially doesn't recognize drive P. Now, again, because I'm telling you what the problem is, it should become immediately apparent that, oh, wait a minute, they may have added the drive to the cluster, but they didn't add it as a dependency. Now, I could also show you the PowerShell. I'm not going to show you the PowerShell just because on a big screen like this, it's sometimes easier just to show it in the GUI. So let's go back out to Failover Cluster Manager. And the other way you can verify this, even if you don't look in SQL and execute the query, at the resource group level, or in this case, services and applications, in Windows Server 2008, one of the best things I think they did from an admin tool standpoint is they added this thing called the dependency report. So you can visually see what things are connected, and lo and behold, this disk is just hanging out here having a good time on its own. It's having its own party. So, really simple way to fix this, and the best part is, starting with Windows Server 2008 and later, this is completely an online operation. You do not need to take any downtime for this. In Windows Server 2003 and earlier, this was, you had to take SQL Server down, add the pain in the butt. So you look at the properties of the SQL Server resource, select the Dependencies tab, because it's already in the resource group. Select the disk, just this. I can go back and re-execute this query. You've just fixed the problem. Now again, this is where I go back to what I said at the beginning. This is where you sometimes need to be smarter than your Windows admins and your storage admins, because they have no idea that SQL Server needs to be a dependency for SQL Server, but you need to know that. And this is how you would essentially troubleshoot that issue. So this is sort of the kind of simple case of what could go wrong. Now I'm going to do something that I know is the bane of some people's existence, because I actually showed this yesterday. Oh, I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to inject it. So let me actually, I'll use 2014. Doesn't matter for this example. So I'm going to try and install another instance. I don't have another drive, but that doesn't matter because I'm not going to get that far. I want to actually show you. All right. So how many people here are very familiar with the network binding order error in? All right, about a third of you. I'm going to show you how to fix that. So wait till SQL Server setup starts. Any day now. All right. Actually, while I'm here, I can show you stuff with this cluster related to AD, which will come in later. So, quick things on names. I've got this Asia instance. I've got Pretzel Logic, which is a named instance. I've got Steely Dan, which is the name of my Windows Server failover cluster. This is the first thing that one of the first things you're going to have problems with your admins, because all these things need unique names. And the reason you need unique names because they all get created, as I said, on the back end in Active Directory. Now, what does that look like? So let me pull up my domain controller and show you. So if I look at Active Directory users and computers, you'll see here I've got my nodes, which are Becker and Fagan. I've got Pretzel, and I'll explain to you why it's just Pretzel in a second. And I've got Steely Dan, and up here I've got Asia. So just this one cluster had all these objects created on the back end, which is kind of a problem for some folks because they like to lock down AD, and that's the last demo I'm going to try and get to and show you. But in this case, they're created, everything looks honky-dory. But, if one of these things goes bad or south, then you will start to have issues. Or let's say somebody deletes things. I'll show you that as well. All right, so hopefully this is started. All right. So I'm going to try and install my first node cluster so I can get to the point where it does the network stuff. So the reason I'm not showing you this via command line is because what would happen in a command line install is it would just go do its thing. You wouldn't see any of these warnings pop up. You would actually have to go into setup files later and look. Let me actually show you where those live in the meantime while that starts. So if you're ever looking for these setup logs for SQL Server, you go to your program files, Microsoft SQL Server, the version of SQL Server that you're installing. So I've already installed, this happens to be a mixed cluster, by the way, so I have SQL Server 2008 R2 and a SQL Server 2012. So I'm going to go to, let's say, the 11.0, which is SQL Server 2012, set up Bootstrap, log. Now, it's not intuitive, but that's where it all lives. The first thing you'll see here is summary. Summary is a text file which contains the information about the latest running of any form of setup against that instance. So whether it be a service pack or a CU or whatever, if you're troubleshooting setup issues for SQL Server that happen during SQL Server setup, look here first because the answer may be apparent. Now, if the answer here is not apparent or cryptic or something, let's look at, say, one of these here. Okay, you would then look at what's known as detail.txt. Now, again, I've looked at this file more than I would like to ever admit. But here is literally everything that SQL Server does in install. So wherever it failed will show up usually towards the latter end of the file. And this one was actually successful, so there's nothing here that I'm going to show you. But where this also becomes important, too, is that if you're installing on Server Core, for example, well, Server Core has no GUI, and I actually have Server Core right here, and that's going to be one of my troubleshooting things in a second. So also notice, interestingly enough, with Windows Server 2012, what they do with Server Core, if you installed a Server Core, the screen here is actually a different color. So that's also sort of a visual cue that I'm running on Server Core. If you'd start as the GUI and switch down to Server Core, it has the other color. But if you actually install it as Server Core, fun fact, it's a different color. Welcome to Server Core. How many people here are using Server Core? Very small percentage of you. I would recommend that you start looking at it because it does save you some space and stuff, but that's not the purpose of this talk. I'm just showing you that in this environment, troubleshooting this may be potentially very different than that interface I was just in, because when you have a full-blown GUI, there are a lot of things at your disposal. Now, if you have a way of remoting in and using those kinds of tools, may not be an issue, but that isn't always the case. So here, we'll get into the troubleshooting this in a sec, but you'll see that if you don't know command line or PowerShell or anything like that, and all you have is a command prompt or a PowerShell prompt, you're going to get lost very quickly in your troubleshooting efforts. So I strongly encourage you to learn things like PowerShell to be able to troubleshoot if you're going to be deploying Server Core. All right, and that goes for standalone too, not just clusters. That's a universal thing. All right, so now you've seen where setup logs live. You've seen a bit of Server Core, we're trying to get back to in a second. And we'll get to these, hopefully this in a second. It's, of course, I'm running on this little box over here, so it's not as fast as a real server. Any questions in the meantime while I'm doing this? Question over here. Could you grab the microphone and hand it to him, because this is also past TV, so I would like the audience to hear the question. Thank you so much.
One issue happened in one of our clusters. When we add the disk, it says it has to be in the maintenance mode. It's Windows 2008. Normally we have a downtime for that, but really Windows team did not find any.
So the issue there, as you saw, I did it completely online. And I could actually add a disk here completely online. Usually if you see issues like that, they're related to your storage unit not being able to add the storage completely offline. But I could tell you Windows itself, and if we have time at the end, I will show you, as long as your storage unit supports it, you can completely add storage online without any issues. So check with your storage vendor to see if they're the ones that require it, because I can tell you Windows does not. Next question right there.
We've had a couple of issues where either a firmware update or a Windows update will break the public NIC team. Is there a way to mitigate that effect so it doesn't happen as often? Or have you found any tricks to work around that to where it won't, to lessen the possibility?
All right, so my question to you would be, what version of the OS are you using, and are you, first question is,
Windows 2008 Standard Edition.
okay, so you have two things going on there. Well, the good news is that starting with Windows Server 2008, Microsoft doesn't care if you team any NIC. So that's no longer an issue where it was prior to Windows Server 2008. But so in that case, chances are, well, not chances are, you are using some third-party or vendor-provided NIC teaming stuff, right?
Correct. It's HP.
So honestly, the only way to probably get around this, and it's not going to really be an option for you, unfortunately, would be to use the built-in stuff which comes with Windows Server 2012. Because Microsoft doesn't check against third-party software necessarily, so it'd be up to HP to verify that their stuff doesn't get broken if you apply a certain hotfix. So unfortunately, I don't have a better answer for you. I would say if you ever switch to Windows Server 2012, consider using the native teaming software, and you may not see that issue any longer.
We're starting to use it. But in that situation where if it's Windows 2008 Enterprise or Standard, in your opinion, is there any added benefit to teaming the NIC as opposed to just like having a single public and a single private NIC?
If you, sort of as I said earlier, if it is actually redundantly teamed or redundantly pathed underneath the covers, and you can verify all that stuff, I would say that you might be able to get away with not having different ones. But however you get your redundancy, just make sure. So you just need to ask. But all right. So here finally we have our issue, and we see here it's that lovely network binding order issue. So how do you fix this? Well, first of all, what is really causing this is that when you create the Windows Server failover cluster, it creates, in essence, a ghost network adapter. And I'm going to show you that in a second. So you open up a command prompt here. Make sure it's run as admin, because if it barks at me for any reason. So you'll see here that this Microsoft failover cluster virtual adapter thing. This GUID is going to become important in a minute, but just know for this very second that there's this failover cluster virtual adapter. That gets created only when you create the cluster. Now, one of the prerequisites for failover clustering is that you set the order of the network cards properly. And what SQL Server and Windows kind of really cares about is the fact that your externally faced network is above your internally facing network. That's what it's really checking for. So in this case, ostensibly, I have my public network here, and I have my private network here, and it looks OK. So why is SQL Server barking at me? Well, it's barking at me because of this failover cluster virtual adapter. Now, you can't see it, but if you go to HT local machine system current control set services TCP/IP linkage, and then the bind, and you look at the GUIDs and you match them to this list here, you'll actually see, oh, wrong window, that the cluster virtual adapter is the top of the stack. So all I have to do is this, move it to the bottom of the stack. Now, don't necessarily recommend you mucking the registry if you don't have to, but I'm showing you how to fix this if you see this issue. So now, if I actually go back into setup and rerun this, notice it's gone. That is what causes that issue. Now, maybe another network card that popped up to the top, but that is usually the issue from a cluster standpoint. This issue largely goes away in Windows Server 2012. They actually fixed it. We had a conversation at one of actually the MVP summits about this, and then they looked at the issue, and there's no backrev fix that they made for Windows Server 2008 R2, or there's no service pack or hotfix you can get for it. But just know that if you're installing Windows Server 2012, I have seen it intermittently, but it's very rare that I've ever seen it. So if you've standardized on installing your SQL Server deployments on Windows Server 2012, you shouldn't really see this issue. Okay. So I've got another 20 minutes. I've got enough demo stuff to fill that. Let's switch gears a bit. So that server core cluster, it's in a failed state. So how, I just know that because I set it up, but if I do this, oh, wait, no. Did I not set it to the right thing? Oh, I must have reset it, darn. This is going to fail anyway, so I'll get this kicked off and then we'll see the failure in a second. So, love it when I don't clean up my own demos to reset it back to really broken. So let me just reset this real quick. All right, so I'm going to now just kind of go kick off that install back here, and it is going to fail. All right, run firstnode.bat. Okay, so while this runs, it's going to eventually fail. We'll come back and diagnose this. I'm just installing SQL Server 2012. Nothing fancy here. Okay. Let's look at the AD issues a little bit. Because as I said, this to me is one of the hardest things that you're going to have to deal with as an administrator. Now, I already ran cluster validation on this, but I'm going to run it again. And then I'm going to run it after the fact on one of the other nodes to show you, or one of the other clusters to show you what it looks like when you are running it after the fact. And there's a difference between Windows Server 2008 R2 and Windows Server 2012. So this is actually Windows Server 2012 R2. You know what, I'll just run this now, what the heck. So, what was my node name? All right, so I'm going to verify this cluster. Now, or these potential nodes that are going to be part of this cluster. So you notice that it asked me earlier, by the way, if I want to run a single test or all the tests. For a cluster configuration to be supported, you actually have to run all the tests, not just one of the tests. So while this is running, I'm now going to go show you, let me go back to that Windows Server 2008 R2 cluster that I just showed you here and run it, because this is already up and running. Just close extra windows. And let me validate this cluster. So here, now here it says, for example, I'll show you what run only tests. Where I use run only like a single test or a set of tests is if I had a problem, let's say early on, that validation picked up. That I want to go and fix, but I don't want to spend an hour running this if I have a lot of disks, for example. I'll go fix that thing, run validation. If it's fixed, then I'll go back and run everything. But as I said, running that single test can also be a false positive for that cluster error thing that I showed you earlier. So be very careful with that. Make sure that a full suite of tests was run. All right. But the thing that I want to show you, because this is really important, because here's where dumb admin will come into play. Dumb admin who thinks they're really smart, who doesn't know much about clusters, wants to go run validation. He heard it's a good thing. So if you look here, in Windows Server 2008 R2, and it's this way also in 2008 actually, it basically says, hey, whoever you are running this thing, I see that you've got some disks in use. Are you sure you want to run? But if you want to run, do you want us to basically leave these groups alone and you can do your thing? Well, if you select this top option, which clearly says leave the listed services or application online, continue testing although disks that are online will not be tested, this means that your SQL servers will not be taken offline. Smart admin would read that and go, well, gee, I have a SQL server up and running. I think I want to leave it alone. Dumb admin will say, no, you know what? I should probably test disks. Imagine this is 12 o'clock in the afternoon. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, or 5 p.m. on Friday. Whenever this is. Now, I'm going to run this just to show you, first of all, that you can run validate online in the middle of the day if you have to without taking anything down, if you have a shared disk. So I selected the right thing. I elected not to take my SQL servers offline and do disk tests. But you have to have these conversations with your Windows admins because they aren't going to know. It's actually worse in Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2. And let me show you how. They basically flipped it. Yeah. No, it's actually worse than that. I heard the groans. So for those of you on past TV, if you heard the groans, it's going to be for good reason, once you see in a minute. So here I've got my clusters. Can't administer the other one this way, but a cool thing, by the way, with, say, this version of in Windows Server 2012 R2 is that you can actually have multiple clusters listed here and their status. You can click on it here, so if you're managing things from a single place, you'll kind of have a roll-up view of some stuff. So they've done a lot of improvements in the Failover Cluster Manager UI in 2012 R2. But that's not why I'm showing you this. So if I run validate cluster, it's a completely different screen. All right, this looks the same. This looks the same. This is not the same. So what they did here is instead of basically saying, hey, I notice you've got applications running in your cluster. In this case, also notice, by the way, services and applications has changed to roles. That's another terminology change between 2008 R2, and now in Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2. So you need to be aware of all these subtle differences to be able to sort of, again, have conversations, because if you say, well, it's a service or application and your admin's looking at the 2012 UI, they may have no idea what you're talking about. So you need to understand that there are subtle terminology changes in the UI here. But basically what they've done here is all they do is select which storage to validate. They don't tell you, while they do tell you it is part of something, they're not going to make the association. They're presenting storage, whereas 2008 and 2008 R2 presented applications. So you need to be really doubly sure you have a conversation with your admins who want to run validation, or even if you want to run validation, that you don't accidentally select the wrong thing depending on the OS that you're running. Bad mojo is going to happen to you. So heed my warnings on this one. Let me see how my server core thing is doing. Yep, failed. Excellent. You know, that's generally not what you want to hear, but in this case, I'm good with that. All right. So first, let me see if it did anything. So let me do get cluster resource. No, it didn't do anything. So here, I could be lazy. Well, not lazy, but I could do this. You'd have to go cd program files Microsoft SQL Server 11.0 set up bootstrap log. All right, the fact that I know off the top of my head is not good. Another thing, by the way, you can run Notepad in Server Core. So here, it basically said, you know, I would have to at this point go into detail.txt. Now, I did have some other failed ones which I want to show you here. So let me actually do this in a place where you can actually see. I think it's because actually that Alfred directory. Let's actually look here because, quite frankly, I'm going to show you some of the older ones where I had some issues as well, and I had a lot of them. So here you'll see there's like a little stack issue. So if you scroll up, for this particular implementation, I was using file share, an SMB share, which is supported by SQL Server 2012. But it kept failing, and I was like, why is it failing? And again, I set this up intentionally this way. Well, the answer is clearly right here, and it's hard to see in this whole thing, but basically what this whole error message says is I don't have enough rights on the file share to do it. Now, when you get to if you're using this during the GUI, it's not going to pop up a message and say you don't have rights. You actually have to go into the detail.txt and see this message for yourself that basically says it's right here, buried way deep, that says I don't have permissions. And if you're on Server Core, this is all you're going to have access to. So you would have to now go to another admin to fix this issue, right? So that's a problem. I had some other failed stuff. Let me see if I can find one of those. So this one failed. Okay. Root data directory, default log directory. See, here we go right around here. So it's usually pretty clear where it starts to happen because you start seeing words like error. I mean, it seems stupid, but you know, sometimes it's intuitive. And here's another one. This is a different error because the other one was a permission that it needed from a local server standpoint, but here I actually didn't have access to the file share itself. So I had to fix two separate issues to get access to that file share. And again, these are issues you might have to work out due to, you know, you not having access or whatever. So, all right. Now let me get back to my AD stuff up here, because that should hopefully be done here. It basically said I was good, but let me go look at the report, even though I clicked right down to it. So if I go to C, Windows, Cluster, Reports. I tried to create a cluster earlier, but I destroyed it. So again, it's got a few messages for me. So Let me see why it's barking at me. So the nice thing is this is just an archive. So I can click on this, it says network. So we were talking earlier about the use of a single NIC. And it tells me right here in validation, hey, look, you've got a single NIC that I see. We think this may be problematic, but we're not sure. Just double check. So again, it's telling you up front before you even do anything there, you might have an issue. So you know to now go and look. Storage. So this is going to be an AG cluster. So I don't have any storage. It's warning me that I don't have disks. Okay, that's fine. This other one, on the other hand, is going to be an issue. Validate Active Directory configuration. It's telling me that the user I'm logged in as has no rights in Active Directory. So all those objects I just showed you, or actually doesn't have rights in the computer's OU. So if I go try and create this cluster, which I'm going to go do now, it's going to fail miserably. But I want to show the failure to you and how to correct that. So if I do pass cluster, I'll give an arbitrary address of like 87, because it's not going to matter. Already said, nope, I'm out. Have a nice day. What this problem is that, well, if I get to my DC, I don't have create computer objects rights on this particular OU. So what I have to do is I have to make sure, or you have to have the conversation with your security admins that it has rights on that OU. Oops, and I just screwed up all my other VMs, but that's okay. You know, it's all demo, right? I can fix that later. Yes, question? So the question is, can you essentially create these objects in the OU ahead of time? And the answer is absolutely yes. That's one of the mitigations if your AD is locked down. But the problem is now that becomes a process, and if you start doing this stuff a lot, they're going to hate you. So you need to really make sure that they understand what's going on here, right? So now that I've added that, I'm going to go back and try and create my cluster. Your question up front. Yes? Yes?
Typically, there is a big disconnect between sysadmin and you're like, give me a sysadmin access and I'll configure the cluster, and after that, you take the rights back. Is there a better approach, or like we have to create, or there is another security permissions available in Windows which allows you to create only cluster?
No, there is no. So the question is basically, are there specific permissions that say, if I want to create clusters, can I set it up this way? And the answer is no. You have to just know all this stuff and communicate it to them, and there's no way. So here it let me do. Okay, so one thing I will tell you, so what about domain admin? Never use domain admin. I don't recommend going in and doing stuff as domain admin. I recommend following procedures and policies and getting this stuff done the right way, because if you get domain admin stuff in some environments, that becomes a real nightmare, especially if they get audited. So, question here. Yeah, I mean, there are other ways to handle so the question is, you can delegate authority and stuff like that. There are ways to handle this, but again, that's a process that you need to work out in your own organization of how you want to handle that, because some organizations won't ever want to delegate, and it's only like one guy sitting in a corner dealing with AD. So now, let me take this a little bit further and try and create a listener in Active Directory with an AG. So what I do have here is two standalone instances of All right, that's not what I wanted. Okay, where's Management Studio? Well, the problem is I literally just got these up. So pin to taskbar, where's Configuration Manager? So this is 2014. So for those of you that don't know, one of the things that you have to do to enable a availability group is actually done on the service itself. And it checks to see if you're part of a cluster. Now here's a little gut check for you. Unlike SQL Server setup for an FCI, this check, when you enable it here, all it does is check that this node is part of a cluster. It doesn't check validation. So you have to check validation yourself, okay? But I'm going to do this. I'm going to enable the availability groups feature. Now, the ironic part about this is you have to stop and start the SQL service to start the availability feature. So schedule something like this in a outage window. Because what I essentially just did is I'm upgrading, for lack of a better word, my standalone servers to now be a cluster to be able to do availability groups. So now let me refresh this. Let me restart SQL Server over here. I'm going to do the same thing on the other node. Let's go to SQL Server Configuration Manager. We'll enable this. And then I'm going to create a quick availability group and show you that I'm going to fail. Because of a policy, because of something I set in Active Directory. And I know we're at 6:15, but I just want to finish this demo because this just shows you the power of AD and why it goes south. So now let me go back here. Start for the first time. It's going to say, yeah, I'm starting for the first time. So, all right. Let me quickly create a database. And I have to do a quick backup of it, and I'll do a quick restore of it on the other side. So it is stored. I normally wouldn't use a GUI for this, but this is just a really quick down and dirty demo with nothing funky. So it's in Program Files, Microsoft SQL Server. Here, data, oh sorry, not data's backup. Okay, so I'm going to now take this and go to, this is broken AD2/C $. Okay, so I'm going to just put it here. Rule number 1001, never type in a demo. Okay, let me connect to broken AD2. I'll restore that because I'm just trying to speed some of the process along. So we'll go from a device. Again, not how I would normally do this, but so it's on C, backup. I don't know if anybody noticed, by the way, they changed the UI a little bit here. This is now not buttons, but it's actually a drop-down. Used to be like buttons. Okay, so now I'm going to create my availability group. Have my database. Let me add my other replica in. How I create this honestly doesn't matter. I don't need to synchronize because I've already restored it. I'm actually not creating a listener, by the way. By default, I'm not creating one here because I want to show you this error specifically later. So now, got my AG, it's all good. Let's say it's a week later, I decide I want to create a listener. Add availability group listener, that'd be nice. Okay, so here I go. All right, I want to create a pass listener and static IP. I'll do 1433. 1433. So 200, 201, 202 dot, I don't know, 73. And it should give me an error. All right, yay. So basically, it's telling me, hey, I can't bring this thing online. Now, you saw that I gave that cluster admin create computer objects rights on that specific OU in Active Directory. So in theory, he should have been able to then, or the cluster itself should have been able to go create that object. Now, let me show you first in Active Directory that here's broken AD 1 and 2, and everything seems to be right in here, but the other issue, and I'm going to cut to the chase because I know I'm a little over, is that in ADSI edit, there's essentially a property you can set in your domain which says how many machines that an account can register. If your admin set this to 0, or you're out of the number of tries for that particular account, you can't add anything to Active Directory. So that's why it failed. If I now go set this to, say, 4, this should work, hopefully. So let me go back here. This should work. Let me try it again. Yeah, you can look at, so let me go out to the cluster itself. And see here, error 5, warning 1. It does say things like computer object can't be associated. They're pretty clear. For example, when we tried to create, here it is, it's actually right here. So cluster network name resource pass AG pass listener failed to create the associated computer object and domain SQLHD.com resource online. So Windows 2008 R2 and stuff, they actually don't have this level of detail. This is stuff they've added to later versions of Windows, but in essence, you should still be able to see some of this information, in your error logs. So I know I'm a little over, and I know that I've showed you a bunch of different things. There are a couple other demos I also had keyed up in case we had time. But this just shows you the importance of everything underneath SQL Server. I was in SSMS, but it wouldn't let me do anything. You see here, after I added, after I changed the number of computers that I could create, I could now create the listener. So this is why, as a SQL Server DBA, you have to know all this stuff, or at least have a working knowledge of all this stuff. Otherwise, you run into issues like this, where all of a sudden you can't create the listener, which is seemingly a SQL Server operation, but it creates stuff in the cluster, create stuff in Active Directory. And oh, by the way, as a follow-on to that, which let me show you real quick, there's also DNS. So if you don't have dynamic DNS, anything that gets created in Active Directory would also need an object and an entry in DNS as well. So you have to coordinate all this stuff just to get your clusters working. And if it's not all working right, then you're going to have issues. All right, so I've gone over. I apologize for that. So let me quickly summarize. Make sure you understand that everything, as you saw, is tightly coupled. As you saw when we got the error creating the listener, problems will manifest themselves in SQL Server, but that wasn't a SQL Server error at all. It was actually an Active Directory issue. If you plan properly and you do all your testing, hopefully you will mitigate all these issues ahead of time and have like zero downtime and prevent dumb admin, especially with things like validation. Some quick business. We're in the booth downstairs if you want to come visit. There's all my contact information. I'm working on my new book now, and if you use that discount code until the 1st of December, you can get 20% off. So with that, thank you for sticking around. Hope you enjoyed it, and please fill out your evaluations. Thank you so much.